best one for me is Ellen DeGeneres, who is, by the way, a very nasty person. I've had dealings with her in Australia.
Bit of
could I tell you some stories about that cow? But anyway, good riddance to her. But she was quite friendly with that P. Diddy bloke, wasn't she?
Over the past few days, a piece of audio has started circulating online, and depending on who you ask, it's either a shocking clue or just another example of how fast speculation can spiral out of control. The recording is being linked to victims connected to Jeffrey Epstein's case, and almost immediately people began asking the same question. What exactly does it prove? And who does it really implicate? Because as the clip spread, so did the claims. Names started getting pulled into the conversation, including Ellen DeGeneres and Ghislaine Maxwell, with some online users suggesting connections that go far beyond anything that has been officially confirmed. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because while the Epstein case itself is real, documented, and deeply disturbing, with verified victims, investigations, and convictions, the internet has a way of taking fragments of information and building entire narratives around them, sometimes mixing fact with assumption in a way that becomes hard to separate. Now suddenly this audio isn't just being discussed, it's being used to support much bigger theories about hidden networks, powerful figures, and alleged activities that have never been proven in court or confirmed by credible investigations. So the real question becomes, are we uncovering something meaningful here? Or are we watching how quickly a story can evolve when speculation takes over? Because once names, emotions, and serious accusations enter the conversation, the line between truth and interpretation gets thinner, and what people believe can start to matter just as much as what can actually be proven. To understand why this audio clip is getting so much attention, you have to go back to the foundation of the case it's being connected to, because without that context, it's easy to get lost in the noise. The name at the center of all this is Jeffrey Epstein, a figure whose crimes are not speculation, but documented fact. Epstein was convicted and later charged with running a large-scale sex trafficking operation involving minors, with investigations revealing that he used his wealth, influence, and connections to exploit vulnerable young girls over many years. His associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, was later convicted for her role in recruiting and facilitating that abuse. These are not theories. These are outcomes of legal processes backed by evidence, testimonies, and court rulings. But what made the Epstein case so different from others wasn't just the crimes themselves, it was the network surrounding him. Epstein wasn't an isolated figure. He moved in circles that included politicians, business leaders, and celebrities. Flight logs, photographs, and documented associations showed that he had connections to many high-profile individuals. Now, it's important to be very clear here. Being connected or photographed with someone does not automatically mean involvement in their crimes. However, those connections raised questions about how someone like Epstein was able to operate for so long without being stopped, and whether systems of power and influence played a role in protecting him. That's where the public interest began to expand beyond the confirmed facts. People started asking bigger questions about accountability, about who knew what, and about how certain individuals managed to avoid scrutiny for years. And when Epstein died in custody under controversial circumstances, those questions only grew stronger. Officially, his death was ruled a suicide, but the unusual details surrounding it, security failures, missing footage, and procedural inconsistencies, led to widespread skepticism. Again, skepticism doesn't equal proof of something else happening, but it does explain why so many people continue to question the full story. Now, as time passed, more documents related to the case began to surface. Court filings, testimonies, and previously sealed records. Each release added pieces to the puzzle, but not always clear answers. Instead, they often introduced more names, more connections, and more complexity. And this is where the environment became especially sensitive, because when you have real crimes, real victims, and real unanswered questions, it creates a space where speculation can easily grow. People want explanations, and when those explanations aren't fully available, they sometimes fill in the gaps themselves. This brings us to figures like Ellen DeGeneres, whose name has appeared in online discussions not because of confirmed involvement in the Epstein case, but because of broader conversations about influence, connections, and public image. Ellen, for years, was one of the most recognizable figures in television, known for a positive and approachable persona. However, in more recent years, she faced criticism related to workplace culture on her show, which changed how some audiences viewed her. And when public perception shifts like that, it can make people more likely to include a name in wider discussions, even when there's no verified link to specific allegations being made. So what you're seeing now is the result of multiple layers coming together: a real and serious criminal case, ongoing public curiosity about its unanswered aspects, and a digital environment where information spreads quickly and interpretations spread even faster. The audio clip that's now trending didn't appear in isolation. It entered a conversation that was already active, already emotional, and already filled with questions. And because of that, it's being viewed not just as a piece of information, but as potential evidence within a much larger narrative that people are trying to understand. But as we move forward, it becomes even more important to separate what is confirmed from what is claimed, because without that distinction, the story can quickly shift from investigation into assumption. And that's exactly where the next part begins. So now we get to the moment that actually sparked this wave of attention: the audio clip itself. Because up until this point, everything we've talked about was already part of an ongoing conversation. But what changed recently is that a recording began circulating online, being described as a voicemail connected to a victim from the Jeffrey Epstein case, and almost instantly, it grabbed people's attention. Not just because of what was being said, but because of how it was being framed. The moment it hit social media, captions started appearing alongside it, suggesting that this wasn't just another piece of information, but something that could expose deeper connections involving powerful figures, including Ellen DeGeneres and Ghislaine Maxwell. And that's where the situation started escalating quickly. The audio itself is emotional, unsettling, and clearly tied to someone speaking about serious experiences. That alone is enough to make people stop and listen. But what pushed it into viral territory wasn't just the content. It was the interpretation being attached to it. Posts began claiming that the recording contained hidden implications, that it pointed toward larger networks, and that it supported theories that had been circulating online for years. And as those interpretations spread, they started getting repeated as if they were confirmed, or even though no official source had verified those specific claims. This is where timing plays a huge role. The Epstein case is still one of the most talked about scandals in recent history, and every time new material, real or alleged, appears, it reignites public interest. People are already primed to pay attention, already aware that there are aspects of the case that feel unresolved. So when something like this audio surfaces, it doesn't enter a neutral space. It enters a conversation that's already filled with suspicion, curiosity, and a desire for answers. And because of that, it spreads faster and hits harder than it might have otherwise. At the same time, the way information moves online adds another layer of complexity. Clips get reposted without full context. Titles become more dramatic as they're shared. Details get added, removed, or altered depending on who is presenting them. And before long, the original piece of content, the audio itself, becomes just one part of a much larger narrative that has taken on a life of its own. People aren't just listening to what was said anymore, they're interpreting what it might mean, connecting it to other events, and building conclusions that go beyond the original recording. Another factor that contributed to the spread is the inclusion of high-profile names. When figures like Ellen DeGeneres are mentioned, even without confirmed links to the claims being made, it immediately raises the stakes of the conversation. It shifts the focus from a specific case to a broader idea about power, influence, and who might be connected to what. And once that shift happens, the story becomes less about verifying a single piece of information and more about exploring a network of possibilities, some of which may not be grounded in evidence. Meanwhile, discussions around Ghislaine Maxwell add another layer of intensity because, unlike many of the names being mentioned, her involvement in Epstein's crimes is confirmed through conviction. That makes any content associated with her feel more credible at first glance, even if the specific claims being attached to it haven't been verified. It creates a situation where real facts and unverified ideas exist side by side, making it harder for audiences to distinguish between the two. What's happening here isn't just about one recording, it's about how quickly a single piece of content can become the center of a much larger story. A story shaped by timing, or amplified by social media, and influenced by the emotions and assumptions of the people engaging with it. And once that process starts, it becomes very difficult to slow down, because each new share, each new comment, and each new interpretation adds another layer to the narrative. So this is the moment where the incident truly begins, not just with the release of the audio, but with the way it was received, interpreted, and transformed into something much bigger than itself. And from here, the conversation doesn't just continue, it expands. As the situation continues to spread, this is where everything becomes more complex. Because now it's not just about the audio itself, it's about how that audio is being used to build a much larger narrative. And to really break this down properly, we have to separate what is actually known and what is being claimed and what is being assumed by the audience, because all three are now blending together in a way that makes the story feel more definitive than it really is. Starting with what is known, the crimes connected to Jeffrey Epstein and the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell are established facts. Victim testimonies, court documents, and investigations have confirmed that a system of abuse existed, involving recruitment, manipulation, and exploitation over a long period of time. Multiple victims have spoken publicly, describing how they were approached, how trust was built, and how situations escalated into something they could not easily escape. These accounts are consistent in showing that this was not a series of isolated incidents, but a structured operation that relied on multiple layers of participation and silence. And now, when people hear the newly circulating audio, they immediately connect it to that confirmed reality. And that connection makes the recording feel more significant because it appears to fit into a pattern that has already been proven to exist. But this is where the second layer comes in: the claims. Online discussions are suggesting that the audio reveals hidden connections involving figures like Ellen DeGeneres, along with broader ideas about secret activities and networks. However, these specific claims are not supported by verified evidence in court records or official investigations. They are interpretations being built around the audio, not conclusions that have been confirmed by reliable sources. And this is where the third layer, assumption, starts to take over. Once a few people begin connecting those dots publicly, others follow, adding their own interpretations, referencing unrelated events, and reinforcing the idea that everything is part of a single, unified story. For example, past controversies involving public figures, unrelated incidents, or even visual coincidences get pulled into the conversation and presented as supporting evidence, even when there's no direct link. Over time, this creates a narrative that feels complete, even though it's built from a mix of facts and speculation. Another important aspect of this breakdown is how emotional impact influences perception. The Epstein case is deeply disturbing, and rightly so. It involves real victims and serious crimes, which naturally leads people to feel anger, concern, and a desire for accountability. When new content appears that seems connected to that case, those emotions carry over, making the content feel more urgent and more believable. But emotional response doesn't always equal factual accuracy, and that distinction is critical when evaluating claims that go beyond what has been proven. There's also the role of credibility by association. Because Ghislaine Maxwell is confirmed to have been involved in criminal activity, anything linked to her name can appear more credible, even if the specific details being discussed haven't been verified. Similarly, when a well-known public figure like Ellen DeGeneres is mentioned, it draws more attention and gives the story a sense of importance, regardless of whether there is factual evidence connecting her to the claims being made. This combination, real crimes, real names, and unverified connections, is what makes the story so compelling, but also so complicated. Another layer to consider is how information evolves as it spreads. The original audio may contain a specific set of statements, but as it gets shared, summarized, and discussed, new details are often added or emphasized differently. Headlines become more dramatic, interpretations become more confident, and before long, the version of the story that most people see is not the original. It's a version shaped by multiple rounds of retelling. And in that process, the line between what was actually said and what is being suggested can become blurred. At this stage, what we're looking at is not a single clear narrative, but a developing one. A narrative built from real events, layered with ongoing questions, and expanded by public interpretation. It's a situation where the foundation is serious and documented. But the extensions of that foundation, especially the more extreme claims, require careful scrutiny before being accepted as fact. And that's what makes this part of the story so important, because it's the point where the audience has to decide how they process what they're seeing. Do they treat everything as connected, or do they separate confirmed information from speculation? Because the answer to that question shapes how the entire story is understood moving forward. By now, the story has moved far beyond the original audio clip and entered a phase where the reaction itself has become just as important as the content. Because what you're seeing isn't just people listening, it's people choosing sides, forming conclusions, and actively shaping how this narrative evolves. And the reaction is deeply divided. On one side, there's a group of viewers who believe this audio is another missing piece of a much larger puzzle. For them, everything connects: the Epstein case, past controversies, powerful figures, and the idea that certain truths have been hidden for years. They see the resurfacing of this recording as validation that there's more beneath the surface than what has been officially acknowledged. And they treat it as part of a pattern that's finally becoming visible. On the other side, there's a strong pushback from people who argue that the situation is being taken too far. They acknowledge the seriousness of the Epstein case and the confirmed crimes involving Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, but they caution against extending those facts into unverified territory. For them, and the concern isn't about ignoring real issues, it's about maintaining accuracy and not allowing speculation to turn into accepted truth without evidence. And this difference in approach is what creates tension in the conversation, because both sides are engaging with the same topic, but interpreting it in completely different ways. Social media has amplified this divide in a major way. Short clips of the audio, combined with bold captions and dramatic headlines, are spreading rapidly across platforms. Some posts present the claims as if they are confirmed, while others attempt to debunk or question them. And because algorithms prioritize engagement, both types of content continue to circulate, reaching wider audiences and pulling more people into the discussion. The result is a constant loop where the story keeps growing, not necessarily because new verified information is being added, but because more people are reacting to it. At the same time, traditional media outlets have been noticeably cautious. Most mainstream reporting continues to focus on confirmed aspects of the Epstein case, avoiding the more extreme claims that are trending online. This creates a gap between what is being discussed on social platforms and what is being reported through established channels. And that gap, often leads to further speculation, with some people questioning why certain claims aren't being covered, while others point out that responsible reporting requires verification before publication. Another factor influencing the reaction is the involvement, real or perceived, of high-profile names. When Ellen DeGeneres is mentioned, even without confirmed evidence linking her to the claims being discussed, it immediately raises the visibility of the story. Public figures with large platforms naturally attract attention, and their inclusion in any narrative makes it feel more significant. But this also increases the risk of misinformation, because once a name is repeatedly associated with a claim, it can start to feel factual to audiences, even if it hasn't been substantiated. Emotion also plays a major role in how people are reacting. The Epstein case involves real victims and serious harm, which makes any related content feel urgent and important. That emotional weight can sometimes lead people to accept information more quickly, especially if it appears to support the idea that there are still unanswered questions or hidden truths. At the same time, others respond with skepticism, recognizing how easily emotional topics can be used to spread unverified claims. What's happening here is a clear example of how modern information cycles work. A single piece of content, like this audio, enters an already active conversation, gets amplified through social media, and then evolves as different groups interpret it in their own way. And once that process starts, the focus shifts from the original content to the broader narrative being built around it. Right now, the story is less about reaching a conclusion and more about navigating the conversation itself. It's about how people choose to interpret what they see, what they decide to believe, and how they balance confirmed facts with ongoing speculation. And as long as those different perspectives continue to exist, either discussion isn't going to slow down, it's going to keep expanding. At this point, the conversation moves beyond just the audio, the names, or even the specific claims, and starts focusing on something deeper. Why do stories like this feel believable to so many people? Because even when certain parts are unverified, the reaction they generate is very real. And that tells you something important about the environment we're in right now. Over the past few years, public trust in powerful institutions, media, entertainment, even authority figures, has shifted. People are more willing to question what's presented to them, more open to the idea that not everything is fully transparent, and more likely to revisit past events with a different perspective. And when that mindset meets a case like Jeffrey Epstein, which already exposed real failures, real crimes, and real unanswered questions, it creates a space where almost any new piece of information feels significant. One of the key dynamics at play here is the difference between evidence and narrative. Evidence is what can be verified, documents, testimonies, court rulings. Narrative is how those pieces are interpreted and connected. In the Epstein case, the evidence is serious and well documented, but the narrative surrounding it continues to evolve, often expanding beyond what has been confirmed. And that expansion is driven not just by new information, but by the human tendency to look for patterns and meaning. When multiple events involve power, secrecy, and unanswered questions, it becomes natural for people to assume they are connected, even when those connections haven't been proven. Then another important factor is how language shapes perception. Terms like exposed, hidden truth, or secret network carry a strong emotional weight. They suggest that something important has been uncovered, even before that information has been verified. And when those terms are attached to real cases or recognizable names, like Ghislaine Maxwell or Ellen DeGeneres, they amplify the impact of the story. The audience doesn't just see a claim, they feel like they're uncovering something significant, but that feeling, while powerful, doesn't always align with factual confirmation. There's also the role of association bias, which plays a major part in how this story is being interpreted. Because Maxwell is confirmed to have been involved in criminal activity, anything linked to her name can feel credible by default. And because Epstein had connections with high-profile individuals, those connections can be interpreted in ways that go beyond what is actually known. But association alone doesn't establish involvement, it only establishes proximity. And that distinction is critical, even though it's often overlooked in fast-moving discussions. Another layer is the way unanswered questions influence belief. The Epstein case still has gaps. Questions about how he operated for so long, who may have known more than they admitted, and why certain aspects remain unclear. Those gaps create space, and in that space, different explanations can emerge. Some are grounded in evidence, others are speculative, but all of them compete for attention. And when people encounter a new piece of content, like this audio, they naturally try to fit it into one of those existing explanations. There's also a psychological element to this. People are drawn to stories that challenge what they think they know, especially when those stories involve power, secrecy, and high stakes. It creates a sense of discovery, of seeing something others might have missed. And in a digital environment where content spreads quickly, that sense of discovery becomes shared. One person's interpretation becomes a community's belief, reinforced through repetition and engagement. At the same time, it's important to recognize that complex situations rarely have simple explanations. Real-world events, especially those involving large networks and long timelines, are often messy, layered, and difficult to fully understand. When those complexities are simplified into a single narrative, it can make the story easier to follow, but also less accurate. And that's the balance that needs to be maintained, staying open to new information while also being careful not to accept conclusions that haven't been supported by reliable evidence. So when you step back and look at everything together, what you're really seeing isn't just a story about an audio clip or specific individuals. It's a reflection of how information is processed, interpreted, and shared in today's world. It's about how real events create a foundation, how questions create space, and how narratives grow within that space. And understanding that process is key, because it allows you to engage with the story without losing sight of what is actually known and what still remains uncertain.